There are too many women now, too many stories that just allow the providers to take over and they go back like, oh, like, I think I am grateful that this and this and this happened. But did they need to happen? You know, like my water broke and ended up at the hospital a couple hours later and contractions weren't going. So we had to start Pitocin. We needed to break the water. You know, we had to do all these interventions. And of course, the providers make it sound like not only does it need to happen, but it's such a good, positive, the right thing to do, the only thing to do. And so then we go on believing like, oh, thank goodness that we did all these things. And hopefully, you know, most of the time they still have good outcomes. The outcomes are good. But how do we feel about the process? Casey Janae J is our reviewer of the week. And she says, it's true and absolute essential. As a first-time mom, I found the pod and started binging everything Steph had to offer. I felt so prepared throughout pregnancy, labor, and delivery because of her tools and recommendations. I ultimately chose to do an unmedicated birth in a low-intervention labor room with an OB who followed my birth map and respected my decisions. I wouldn't change a thing about my pregnancy, labor, or delivery because of the knowledge I gained and autonomy I had throughout. I send this podcast to all of my friends when they find out they're pregnant. What an awesome review. You guys are amazing. I absolutely love reading these because it reminds me of the hard work that you guys are doing to get what you want. And it's so awesome. So keep it up. Keep doing that hard stuff. You guys, this week we are going to dive into cesarean birth and vaginal birth. Which one is safer? And if you guys have heard me talking recently about inductions and cesareans and all of the things that are kind of being thrown at women right now for pregnancy, this is one of those topics I feel is really important to dive into. And on that note, I do feel like I don't even mean to like jump on a soapbox about this, but I have to say this. The more birth stories that I am reading lately, the more moms that are reaching out to me with questions, I don't know what is happening in the birth world, but you guys are going through it. I feel like providers are just throwing it at you every direction. And more moms seem to be just led down a path that they're not totally in love with when it's all said and done. So if you are here and you are listening, please take all this information in, enjoy it, and utilize it. I would say learn as much as you can about birth. That part is totally, totally important. And maybe I need to do an entire episode on this next part, but find your voice. You are the only one that is going to be able to stand up and say, yes, I want this to happen to my body, or no, I'm not okay with that. But the only way you're going to feel confident doing that is if you understand your why behind it. If you can look at a provider in the face and say, I do not want to schedule a 39, 40, 41 week induction because I am aware that my body and baby are healthy because of these parameters, and I trust the process of birth and being able to allow my body to do this and to feel confident when you're saying it. Because just saying the words, but having the doubt inside of you makes it that much more of a challenge when you walk into that birth space completely vulnerable and in labor land, to be able to take whatever somebody is recommending to you, or and maybe in not such a way that sounds like they're recommending it to you, to take it just as fact and truth. And whatever they're saying becomes the standard, or what has to happen, what must happen. And that it is such a hard place for me to be, because even when I was creating the My Essential Birth course, one of the things that I didn't want it to have to do was make mom feel like she needs to fight. I did not want to create that relationship between mom and whatever provider she's working with, which is why I'm so big about finding a good provider that you can have good conversations with and you feel like you're on the same team. And at the same time, I feel like I have to start training moms. If you are here and listening, you have rights and your body is your own, and you get to make the decisions for you and your baby. And it matters. It matters for your pregnancy. It matters for your birth, and it matters for the rest of your life and for your baby's life. these are big decisions that we are asked to make as we are growing babies, oftentimes in our youth, right? In our early 20s, or I'm not going to pretend I'm coming up to 40 now, and I'm not going to pretend I'm all grown up, and these are big things. These are things that shape us. And yes, we absolutely have an opportunity to learn from the situations that we end up in and to grow and to gain a voice and all of that. But if you are here and listening, hear me now. This matters. This matters. And you are capable of making these decisions for yourself. You do not have to be bullied or coerced into believing that your body is not capable of growing the right size baby for your body and knowing how to birth it. From the beginning of time, that's how everybody is here. Period. End of story. Yes, we can go into all kinds of, if we didn't have this and this and this intervention, we would have all these scary whatevers. But you know what? The majority of women today, with the care that's given and with the health that we have, the things that we know about health and science and bodies today, we have enough knowledge, we have the right information to be able to grow a very healthy baby and then to allow our bodies to birth that baby in a natural way where we leave it alone and trust the process. And you are strong enough to do it both mentally and emotionally, and you should not have to fight for it. But you know what? If you do, it's worth it. If you do find yourself having to stand up and use your voice, it is worth it. And I don't know why that was the beginning of this podcast episode, but it has been on my mind, and you guys need to hear it. You need to hear it because there are too many women now, too many stories that just allow the providers to take over and they go back like, I think I am grateful that this and this and this happened. But did they need to happen? My water broke and ended up at the hospital a couple hours later. And contractions weren't going, so we had to start Pitocin. We needed to break the water. We had to do all these interventions. And of course, the providers make it sound like not only does it need to happen, but it's such a good, positive, the right thing to do, the only thing to do. And so then we go on believing like, oh, thank goodness that we did all these things. And hopefully, most of the time they still have good outcomes. The outcomes are good. But how do we feel about the process and trusting ourselves? And how does it make us feel for the next one? Are we in our heads like, oh, I'm probably going to need to head back and have an induction. I'm probably going to need Pitocin again. I'm probably going to need an episiotomy. So just whatever is happening in your head, whatever language is happening in your head, I don't know, maybe we need to start with affirmations or just positive birth talk. Like maybe I need an entire episode on this. But the way that we are talking to ourselves in the background subconsciously about birth, it's huge and it matters. And it will affect the way that you give birth and how you're going to feel after. It kind of reminds me, as we're talking about this, my family just watched Inception recently. And if you have not watched that, you won't know what I'm talking about. But if you have, they kind of talk about like when you're in a dreamlike state, how these thoughts can be planted. And I'm going to butcher, right, and I'm not going to give away any of the movie because anyways, I'm just not. But just that these thoughts can kind of be planted in the background and they affect everything that you do. And it's so real. So maybe not while we're dreaming and all of that kind of stuff, whatever's happening in the movie. But the fact is, there are deeper things that we think and believe. It's really like beliefs and truths, right? Things that we believe about ourselves or truths that we know, right? That form the thoughts that we have, and those thoughts move into actions, and those actions kind of define us, or they create outcomes. It's just this whole process. And so if we can take it back and really understand how, like, our true nature of like how we feel about birth, and if you can come to a place of feeling safe in the process of birth and trusting it, I think it'll just be such a benefit for you just throughout your pregnancy and birth. And with that, let's dive into today's topic. Sorry, hopefully that'll be on your mind. It's been on mine. I don't know. Feel like there's more conversation around it. But today I want to talk to you guys about cesarean birth and vaginal birth, and which is safer, because believe it or not, there actually is a debate about this. And if you're here, it might be because you're curious. So let's have it out. First of all, I want to go over some myths because I feel like that's fun. And it's probably things that, or maybe things that you have heard, and I want to dispel them right away. So let's talk about that. Also, if you're here and you have not downloaded the 3 free exercise guide, it is so much more than just 3 exercises. So check out the show notes or go to myessentialbirth.com and type in your name and get the exercise guide. But those 3 exercises are not just about exercise. They're about making your body more comfortable, and not just your body, but your labor, your pregnancy and labor, easy, more comfortable, and your baby in a good position. It's like everything that you can do, those kind of like quick daily things that you can do to really feel on top of your space, some kind of control over your birth. And they're going to ease you into that labor process. But the fun part about it is too, once you download it, you get freebies from me all week. You get videos, you get downloads, and it just gives us a chance to connect, and you can reply directly to any of the emails on there with any questions that you have. I have loved connecting with you guys. I feel like when I had said it recently on the podcast, like, you guys, you actually get a hold of me when you email hello@myessentialbirth.com, or you DM me on Instagram. You might get a hold of Chelsea too. Chelsea's pretty awesome. But we're there and we're talking with you guys. So anyways, if you haven't downloaded the exercises yet, start there. Do that. Do it right away. Now, typically, I'm going to say, as far as vaginal birth goes, so let's dive back into the topics, right? Typically, vaginal birth is going to be the safer option. Of course, sometimes it will not always be the best option, and cesarean birth absolutely has its place. So when I'm talking specifically about cesarean birth, because we have some stuff upcoming too, where I want women who have had a cesarean birth to feel like they have a safe place to come and to discuss, and that it doesn't have to be this big, scary thing that everybody should be avoiding like the plague. Because when it is necessary, it can be beautiful. There are absolutely things that you can do to make it as beautiful a process as possible. And not just as possible, like for some women, this is your birth. And like I said, like all of this matters. And really the decision-making behind it is going to be number one. Like, were you involved in the decision-making? Did your provider ask about your preferences, or did you come prepared? I'm going to provide for you guys the gentle cesarean birth plan that I give in the birth course as well. That's a download for this week in the show notes. So that if you do need to have a cesarean birth, I'm going to give you all the very best ways that you can make it as beautiful and wonderful and homey and just wonderful as possible, because that is absolutely an option. But obviously, most of the time, a vaginal birth is going to be safest for mom and baby. So don't be offended if I am talking about this and you're like, yeah, but I needed to have a cesarean. Absolutely. There are totally times when that is the case. So don't feel like I'm talking meanly to you by any means. But let's get into those C-section myths. Number 1. C-sections are easier than a vaginal birth. Maybe you've heard this, and it's just not true. There's just no way. It is a major abdominal surgery. So maybe in the way of easier, and I'll talk about that later. Maybe you're thinking I don't have to have contractions, which again, I'll talk about that later. But it is major abdominal surgery, and any kind of surgery is going to be trickier for mom, trickier for baby, and the healing time is definitely going to be a lot more intense. You do get to schedule your date. You do get to bypass some of the contractions, possibly all of them. Most likely you will experience some, but that recovery is going to be more difficult and it's going to last longer. Okay, myth number 2. If I have one cesarean birth, all of my births need to be cesarean. If you have been told this, if you are a C-section mom and you have been told that you have to have another cesarean birth, or if you are here now and you will be a C-section mom at some point and you are ever told this, this is not true. And there are situations where that might be true. For example, you have like a T-shaped scar or something. You have I'll talk about that later, but there may be reasons where it is the very best and safest, and there's a reason that you need to have another cesarean birth after having one. But most of the time, that's not true. And if you have one, it is not an instant, I have to have all of them that way. And there's, I'm a big VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean advocate, because that's totally part of my story. I had a vaginal birth after cesarean, a home birth, obviously a vaginal birth after cesarean, and both were so good in the way of like healing and recovery and safety. It's absolutely an option for you. And if you're talking about VBAC, that's, topic for another day, but your provider is going to be key, like way, way more am I going to push you with a provider than any other kind of birth, because off the bat, like a lot of providers are just like, no, that's not going to work. Like it's not even an option for you. And that's a big deal. Okay, number 3, if you have a C-section, you can't do things like immediate skin to skin or delayed cord clamping or breastfeeding right away. And that's not true either. In some cases, it might be if there's issues with mom, if there's issues with baby, but otherwise with a healthy mom and a healthy baby and a supportive provider, these things are totally available for you. And like I said, we're going to give you that download. So you'll have a gentle cesarean birth plan available to you. And after we talk about this, like one of my favorite things to do or to tell women to do is like you print the plan, edit it any way that you want. If there's extra things that you feel like it sparks ideas that you want to add or things that you're like, I don't care about that, take it away. But the best part about it is you get to just pack it away and say, I've planned and it's good. And so now I can focus on, unless I absolutely need that, everything else that I have to do with my birth, instead of it being a worry or something that you have to come up with right on the spot if things do go a little bit sideways and you do end up needing a cesarean birth. So let's talk about some pros and cons of cesarean birth. What are the pros? Because there are some pros. So a cesarean birth, as long as it's not an emergency C-section, it's scheduled in advance by your provider. So that's kind of nice. You know the birth date. That gives you an opportunity to be able to call people in to help. Like if your parents are coming out of town or friends or whatever that you're planning as being kind of your like postpartum support or birth support as well. It's nice to be able to tell them like, yep, it's on the 28th. So if you want to get here a couple days early and, then that makes obviously scheduling and planning a little bit easier as long as mom doesn't go into labor before that date, which has happened. But we're going to pretend if you have to schedule a cesarean that's not going to happen to you. You do avoid some risks that can occur with vaginal birth. So for example, shoulder dystocia, which is a big one that providers are saying right now. If you go past 40 weeks, your baby's going to be giant and not fit out your vagina, which most of the time is not true. But with big babies, absolutely, shoulder dystocia is something that can happen. And if you are having a cesarean birth, then you kind of bypass that. Also, if there's any need for vacuum extraction or forceps or an episiotomy, all of that stuff gets bypassed when you do a cesarean birth. There is a certain amount of reduced pain during labor and birth because you're not experiencing all of the contractions, obviously. But I will say this is where I feel like providers are not really great about being clear with moms about what's going to happen, even when they schedule a cesarean birth. And that is 9 times out of 10, you still get to have contractions and you can have them for a while. However, if a mom is in labor, then she will have gone through the labor and had all the experiences of the contractions along with the cesarean birth. Now, if that is the case, because you look at this and you're like, if it's just going to be a cesarean anyways, wouldn't it have been nice to not go through 24 hours or 36 hours of all this labor or whatever the case was? But I will tell you this, for those moms who are listening, and maybe you feel that way because it's happened to you or you would feel that way in the future, every contraction that your baby does experience is a benefit to them. There is like breath work that is like practice breathing that happens with the lungs when baby's being squeezed. There's all different kind of hormones and stuff that are firing when labor is happening. They're good. Contractions are good. And so if that ends up being you, take that as a positive. You can also minimize the risk of the pelvic floor dysfunction that can happen from vaginal birth. Although I will say that even with a cesarean mom, again, if you are experiencing labor and then it does go into a cesarean birth, that labor progress and baby moving down with contractions, it does swell and do all the same kind of fun stuff, which as you heard me share before, I feel like is a little unfair. Like if you're going to go through all of that, baby doesn't come out the vagina, then why does it hurt so bad down there? I feel like you should get a pass, but you don't always get a pass. So be aware of that. But if it is a scheduled cesarean and you don't go into labor, then you're obviously not using all the like same muscles and stuff down there. And so it does tend to be like, cooled off. Now, what are the risks or downsides? Obviously, as I mentioned before, it's major abdominal surgery. You're looking at like 6 to 8 week full recovery, and it makes things a little bit tricky for the postpartum stage as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just in the way of it being a surgery, all surgeries have risks. And along with that, risks that are included for for cesarean surgery include infection, like to the site, right? Whether that's immediately having an infection or afterwards, maybe your scar site or your incision site having some kind of infection to it. There can be an injury to blood vessels or other organs in the body because, it's not perfect, right, every time. And there could be serious bleeding that can happen, and that can require, there can be hemorrhaging and some other things, and it can require some blood transfusion to be in the future there. So those are definitely some serious risks that come along with it. You also have a higher risk of blood clots because after having surgery, you don't move around as much. So like normally after you have a baby and it's a vaginal birth, you're up and walking around and you don't have to really worry as much about blood clots. But with any surgery, that's definitely a risk that's going to be there. Recovery in general is harder than having a vaginal birth, and I can attest to that. Obviously, you have more pain and different pain, and it lasts longer. The other thing that is unfair is even if you don't have the contractions and any of the pelvic floor stuff or anything like that, you still get to bleed for 6 weeks, right? 4 to 6 weeks. And that's because even though you had the surgery, all that happened in your uterus, and now your uterus still has to, it's getting rid of all the stuff with the placenta, all the other like mucus and membranes and all that stuff. It's clearing out. It's becoming smaller. It's shrinking down. And so you've got definitely still have a couple weeks of bleeding while you're recovering from surgery, which again, unfair, but it is what it is. You can't drive for a couple weeks. Trust me, you wouldn't want to. You can't lift things that are heavier than your baby, and even your baby sometimes doesn't feel great to lift. It also makes breastfeeding a little bit wonky. So like not being able to just sit up and hold them over your stomach or have them leaned back onto your chest doesn't feel good because you don't want baby kicking and stuff where your incision site is. So we do have some different holds and stuff that you can do for breastfeeding. It's not the end of the world by any means, but it is a less comfortable experience. Also, any like coughing and sneezing and anything like that afterwards, after you've been, I was going to say something that I'm not going to say, but after you've had surgery and you go to cough or sneeze, it just does not feel great. So utilizing a pillow or something like that is going to be really important. The other thing is babies in regards to cesarean birth. So the babies born via cesarean tend to have a greater risk of asthma and actually obesity. I know that sounds crazy, but there's actually studies to go along with that. And we're going to include some resources for you guys as well. And then as I mentioned, you may be able to do that skin to skin, but you also may not. So depending on if it was a scheduled cesarean and everything went well, or it was an emergency cesarean and baby's not doing well for whatever reason, or the like more scarier thing where mom had to be put under for whatever reason. Maybe the epidural wasn't working, or there wasn't enough time for an epidural, or just something weird where they had to knock mom out, then that can be obviously not a reason to be able to do immediate skin to skin. But if for some reason you are not able to do that and baby is doing well, then your birth partner should be able to. So have them ready to be able to do that. And then just because your baby is breech or a previous birth was a cesarean, like we've mentioned, it doesn't mean you have to have a cesarean. So, recently I've even had people talking about breech birth on here, and some of the resources, like if your baby is breech and you're looking to do a vaginal birth, even to the point of possibly having to drive or fly out of state and stay somewhere in order to have the birth that you're looking for, you have options. You totally get to choose. So just because baby is breech doesn't mean you need to have a cesarean birth necessarily, and there are options out there for you. I think the most important thing is informed consent. You guys get to have all the information and then get to choose. So benefits of a vaginal birth. So some of these might seem obvious, but I'm also going to talk about some risks that come along with it, of course. But in most cases, it's going to be the safest option for mom and for baby. It's an easier recovery. I will tell you from my cesarean birth, and I know I've shared about it, but the thing that just was so crazy and awesome after I had my first vaginal birth after cesarean was I could sit up in the bed and it didn't hurt. And it blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't need help to sit up. I'm sitting up, I'm holding my baby, I'm breastfeeding, I'm walking around, I peed on my own. It was awesome. So, and I think because I had that contrast too, maybe you don't think about it too much, but when you have the contrast, it's like, oh yeah. No major surgery to recover from, although you're downstairs. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you have that quick bonding with the baby. Should be, if things are pretty not complicated, baby's doing well, no meconium aspiration or anything like that, right? You have that immediate skin to skin, breastfeeding, all of that kind of just moves into that natural next next part of the postpartum area. And then you have a less chance of infection because you don't have any like big open wounds that you're dealing with. And baby gets all that good bacteria that happens through the birth canal. So we are learning more and more every day about how important the bacteria in our guts are. And actually, the bacteria that they get as they move through the vagina is actually super beneficial to be all over them, all over their skin, all over their mouth. It is actually making them stronger and healthier, which is awesome. Like our bodies are so made to do this. It is really, really awesome. The other thing that happens when a baby goes through the birth canal, particularly when there is not an episiotomy or any kind of heavy tearing, is there's something called the fetal ejection reflex. So as baby moves through the vagina and they are squeezed by that vaginal canal because it is a tight fit on their way out, if that is kept intact, they have this ejection reflex where it pushes all of the fluid that's in their lungs and helps them to expel it on the way out. And so you have babies that have, clearer breathing airways, and less issues to be able to breathe, and all the asthma and stuff that we had talked about before, that's part of it. So it's just a better way to be born. Like the process of birth is perfect. And that is one of the things that it does, is it has all these benefits as for mom and for baby as baby goes through that canal. And then obviously you have a shorter hospital stay. So you can leave, depending on your hospital and your providers, because I know it varies from place to place, but you can be out of there in less than 24 hours. Like we were out of, even when we did our vaginal birth after cesarean in the hospital, we pushed so hard to just get out of there. And I don't remember exactly how long it was, but I know we were there for less than 24 hours for sure. I want to say it was less than 12 once baby was born. So it was pretty good. Now, risks are downsides. More painful labor and birth experience. So this is during the actual labor part, obviously. But remember that recovery is so much easier. And I don't know that I would consider that a downside. So I did put it, and it totally is real for every mom who has ever given birth. This is my personal opinion. I would not consider that pain a downside. That was like something empowering and amazing to like work through and then feel the strength from that. Like, oh my gosh, I just did that thing. I am Superwoman. That was so cool. I think it's like such a perfect like segue into motherhood where you're just like, boom, I am on top of the world and I am that baby's mom. That just came from my body. That was pretty sweet, The other thing is you do have that possible weakening of the pelvic floor muscles. This is kind of the stuff though, prep work, if you're really good about your prep work prior to labor, so understanding and using that area downstairs, getting really comfortable with your pelvic area, then when it comes to things like pushing and stuff, and also if you don't have an epidural and you really listen to your body about what position it's asking you to be in, and utilizing the strength of your body, but also understanding like why it's asking you to be in a certain position and listening to your body and working with it as you're pushing. I think that can be really helpful. And then if you do have an epidural, having your legs pulled back and shortening that birth canal and not being in a leaned back position, I think all of that actually does help that pelvic area. So keep that in mind. But there definitely is a risk of like prolapse or bladder incontinence, and some of us still deal with that. But there are things that you can do, but it is a risk, obviously, of a baby coming out your vagina. So that's something to think of. If there is a forceps extraction, episiotomy, things that are, forceps, vacuum extraction, or episiotomy, anything that happens downstairs that can cause trauma to baby. It can cause trauma to the vaginal area. So that can happen during a vaginal birth. And then we have that risk of shoulder dystocia, which is it's so tricky for me because yes, it absolutely does happen. I don't want to downplay the fact that shoulder dystocia does not exist. However, our bodies are really good at growing babies that we can birth, even when they are big babies. Now, you're going to work with your provider and all that kind of stuff to make sure that things look good. But I promise you that women birth big babies all the time, and I want to give you some confidence in that way. Now, I know that vaginal birth, I said that was the safest option. Of course, there's going to be some instances where it's not, and that's where C-section steps in, and that's where we're grateful for that 2 to 3% of the time that it actually should be used. So if you have placenta previa, for example, so that's a placenta covering the cervix. If you have a placenta that, for whatever reason, it's covering the spot, where your baby needs to come out of, then that is going to be safer to not have them push into the placenta. They would not make it out. It would be very bad. So yes, that's a moment where we want to be able to utilize that. If, like I had said before, you had a prior cesarean and you would like to do a VBAC, but you do have kind of that T-shaped scar or some other weird stuff happening that does make it unsafe, or a lot less safe to be able to try for that VBAC, then a cesarean can absolutely be the answer. Uterine abnormalities, again, stuff to work with your provider on, and you will know that about your body as well. If baby has any birth defects or need an immediate need of some kind of surgery on the way out, and you and the provider decide that that is the very best thing for baby. Baby that's lying transverse during labor and they're not budging. So that's a baby with a head on one side of your belly and their feet on the other side, and they're just kind of stuck in that sideways, side-lying position. That can be a problem. If you are high risk and you and your provider have decided it is the safest thing to get your baby out faster than allowing time to go on, this can be like preeclampsia moving to eclampsia or other things like that, where you guys have decided it is way safer to get the baby out than to keep the baby in, then that's an option as well. If you're carrying multiples, but with the caveat that this is what you would like to do and that you've been given all of your options ahead of time, because having multiples alone is not necessarily a reason to not attempt and go for a vaginal birth and be successful at it. So again, just like breech babies, you're going to just want to make sure that you find a really great provider so that you have all of those options available to you. Now, I do want to give a quick note to my VBAC mamas that are out there and anybody listening, really, because we are talking about cesarean birth and the risks and benefits and all that kind of stuff. You know, one of the things, and I'll include studies about this as well, and hopefully your provider does go over this with you, but even when we're talking about VBACs, this will be a whole podcast episode, so don't worry. But when we're talking about VBACs versus having a second cesarean, and we talk about those scary things like uterine rupture or death of mom and baby and those big scary things, even in those instances, and I'm just going to kind of pop this information in there, VBAC tends to be safer. And so again, I'm not going to get into all the stats and details and all of that. So be on the lookout for a VBAC podcast episode coming out soon. But if you are a VBAC mom and you're listening to this, I do want to offer some really positive, happy, good information, letting you know that is actually, it ends up being the safer thing. And that can change between mom and baby, what looks safer and what doesn't. But those percentages, they matter big time. And so when you're looking at a mom that's going to have abdominal surgery, actually her chance of having very serious complications and also dying from that procedure is actually higher than a mom who attempts a VBAC, particularly one that is successful with a VBAC, but even for moms that attempt a VBAC and experience something like uterine rupture. So I think that's good information for you to have in your ear, kind of that little birdie in your ear until I can get back to you and give you some more detailed stuff. But I will say, as I'm doing these course updates and all this fun stuff, I just did an entire lesson for VBAC moms that'll come with these course updates in a couple of months now. And it was awesome, kind of diving into all that information and going into the details and just giving really solid stuff for you guys to take with you and feel like, okay, now I know why I'm making the decision to aim for the vaginal birth after cesarean, or why I feel more comfortable having another cesarean again in the future. So all that data and information, all that stuff's in there. Like I said, I'm going to provide resources and some links for you guys today in the show notes if you're curious about some of the stuff that we talked about today. But if you're looking for that deeper dive and you want more detailed information and how to have a conversation with your provider and what to take with you for that provider conversation and all of that, that's all in the birth course, you guys. So if you haven't yet, join me there, myessentialbirth.com/get started, all one word. Read through it, see what we have to offer. Updates are coming. So if you purchase the birth course now, you not only get the current birth course, but you're going to get all of the next birth course as well. And that's going to come with updated workbooks, updated lessons, tons more details of stuff. I'm getting more and more excited by the second. So if that's you, you're a VBAC mom, meet me in the course, and I will see you next week.